The NHS is very dysfunctional. People are just terrified that if they're honest about what went wrong, they're going to get scapegoated. And we end up, I'm afraid, with a culture of cover-up.
We're not just looking at a cover-up culture, we're looking at a blaming culture. We were blamed as families for the deaths of our babies because they couldn't accept that accountability.
Stories that we keep hearing time and again. Babies who have unnecessarily died, been harmed, families left bereft. Now, I'm sure there have been some improvements, but because I am still doing these heartbreaking stories, not enough is changing.
Hello and welcome to the Fourcast. The NHS is facing one of its deepest crises, a string of maternity scandals from Shrewsbury to Nottingham, Oxford to Leeds. Hundreds of babies have died or been left severely injured in hospitals meant to keep them safe. So why does this keep happening? Is it about funding, training, or a system that protects itself instead of patients? To discuss all of this, I'm joined by the former Health Secretary, Jeremy Hunt, who commissioned one of the first major maternity inquiries, our Health and Social Care Editor, Victoria Macdonald, who's been investigating these scandals for years, and Kayleigh Griffiths, a campaigner who lost her daughter in one of the NHS's worst maternity failures. Thank you all very much for joining us. Victoria, first of all, you've done a series of stories in the last few days. Why are we here again?
Well, we've been looking with the New Statesman at Oxford University Hospitals Trust maternity and neonatal units, and it's the same story again of babies who have unnecessarily died, been harmed, mothers harmed, families left bereft. And against a background of defensiveness in the trust, of parents not being listened to, of a lack of duty of candour, the same thing that we've heard over and over again. One mother who had twins who were born at 24 weeks, one of the twins was taken away, wasn't resuscitated, was then brought back to the mother saying, the morgue wouldn't be able to take this baby because it's still breathing. And she was left with this baby having to keep it warm on the radiator until it died. Those sort of stories that we keep hearing time and again.
Kayleigh, after such a long and difficult public battle for you, how did hearing about another series of disasters make you feel?
For me, it's just heartbreaking having to listen to the same thing and the same stories over and over again. And to take a baby back to its mother that was still breathing, I just can't even comprehend that somebody would do that. But fundamentally, we know what the issues are. We've heard time and time again that we know the issues, but we're just coming up with a barrier of actually implementing any of these recommendations. And we need seriously to get to the bottom of what the barriers are and get these recommendations implemented now.
Jeremy, why is it so hard to get these things changed?
It's hard partly because the NHS is very dysfunctional. So everyone has this idea that it's a centralised, well-run machine where someone at the Department of Health or NHS England can say, do this, and tomorrow every maternity unit in the country does it. Unfortunately, it doesn't work like that because, these maternity units are very busy places, and the doctors, the midwives, the nurses have got a lot on their plate. And the thing which is most disappointing is that you can have a mistake, say, in Blackpool, and a coroner can say, we need to change the system so that this doesn't happen again. And then exactly the same thing will happen in Oxford or Cornwall, a few months later. And I think the thing that worries me the most, Krish, in the situation we're in is that we've got into this mentality of uncovering another scandal at yet another hospital. And I think we need to be honest, we've got these problems throughout the NHS. Let's stop saying this is a particular issue at Shrewsbury or Morecambe Bay or Leeds or Oxford. Throughout the NHS, we have got profound problems in the way we deliver maternity services, and we really do need change.
Right, but to what extent is the defensiveness of the NHS, the fact that people's jobs are on the line and they will inevitably try and fight for their own position, at the core of the problem?
Well, I think that is the biggest problem that we have. And I think, look, I don't want to be defensive because these stories are heartbreaking. It's heartbreaking for me because when I was health secretary, this was probably my absolute top priority. But I think it is worth saying that since the original Morecambe Bay statement that I gave to Parliament in 2015, that the Kirkup report, baby deaths have fallen by about 20% across the NHS. And the number of children born at term with severe disabilities is down by nearly a third. So there has been some progress made, but it's not enough. And I think at the heart of it is a really big problem that if you are an obstetrician or a midwife and you make a mistake and there's a tragedy as a result of it, you worry that if you're open and transparent about what happened, you hold your hand up, you say, I think I may have made a mistake. I should have done this, but instead I did that. You worry that you're going to get fired. And we have not learned in the NHS to do what they do in the airline industry, which is distinguish between gross negligence, a pilot turning up to fly a plane when they're drunk, for example, for which there can be no forgiveness. They should never fly again. And the kind of ordinary human errors that everyone can make. And because we don't do that, people are just terrified that if they're honest about what went wrong, they're going to get scapegoated. And we end up, I'm afraid, with a culture of cover-up.
Victoria, in your stories this week, you didn't just uncover defensiveness, you uncovered aggression.
Yes, well, that is true. There were some extraordinary legal letters sent, and which we can't go into too much, but I agree to a certain extent with Jeremy Hunt on the sort of culture and the being too scared to put your head above the parapet. But I think it goes further than that. I think there is so much more about the way people are trained, the way that the NHS has been starved of money. And, let's not forget that Mr. Hunt was there during the time of austerity when spending was not keeping up with inflation. And I think it has progressed from there. There's also this idea of the NHS always being, turned upside down and reorganised. And it has just left people exhausted and not wanting to do the right thing, which is put their hands up. There is also a litigious element to this. So we had one story where this baby was, the consultant left the room during the caesarean section, left it to a more junior member of staff, came back in, it was all going wrong, yanked the baby out with some forceps, and that baby is now quadriplegic. Now that surgeon did say to the parents, I'm really sorry. Took 12 years for the trust to admit 100% of liability. That story spoke to me volumes of what is going wrong on the maternity units.
Kayleigh, to what extent do you think this combination of defensiveness, legality, and resourcing is at the centre of this?
I think massively at the centre of this. When you look at, we're not just looking at a cover-up culture. We're looking at a blaming culture that not necessarily within the NHS, but we were blamed as families for the deaths of our babies because they couldn't accept that accountability. And when we look at accountability, has anybody actually been held accountable for the continuous failures that have been uncovered within maternity services? Because we were promised accountability when Ockenden was published, but actually we've had nothing to date. And I think denial, because as Derek Richford said, the grandfather of Harry, denial is the biggest thief of learning. And by blaming the parents, not listening to the parents, not listening to whistleblowers, all that we ever wanted was learning from Pippa's death. And actually it was just so counteractive. We've never, I've never, as a bereaved parent, wanted to blame somebody. All I ever wanted was to actually work with that hospital to put systems into place that made sure that never happened again. And with this culture that's continuing, we can't get past that. We can never work together currently without addressing those problems.
Jeremy, what about resourcing? When you're changing the way a system runs, are you able to adequately think about culture and the way people think and approach accountability as well?
Well, I think accountability and resourcing are two different things. I mean, on the resourcing side, when I became health secretary, the first thing I dealt with was mid-staffs, and everyone said to me, I'm sure you probably did in a Channel 4 interview, the issue here is short staffing. We don't have enough, nurses in the wards. And so that's why I made every hospital publish the number of nurses they had on every shift in every ward. And we saw a big increase in staffing. And so, I mean, over the last decade, in maternity, for example, midwives is up 11%, maternity nurses up a third, obstetricians up nearly 2/3. So that's been quite a big increase. But unfortunately, we haven't seen a commensurate fall in the number of tragedies like Pippa's tragedy. And I think that this defensiveness is the thing that worries me the most. So many parents that I speak to say exactly the same thing. They're not looking to blame anyone, but they also say that very often when something goes wrong, literally the only person who's on their side is a lawyer. And they therefore end up in these very protracted legal disputes, which take 5, 7, as Victoria said, 12 years. And during any kind of litigation, hospital lawyers tell doctors not to say anything at all or say the very bare minimum necessary. And, I really think we need to look at whether we should have no fault compensation, where compensation is automatic when someone has been wronged by the NHS. It's the system they have in New Zealand. Overall, it costs actually less than the bill that we pay here for clinical negligence. And I'll just give you one example, because I think it boils down to, Derek Richford's point about learning. In Japan, they introduced no fault compensation for babies born with severe cerebral palsy. And they did it about 15 years ago. And since then, they saw a fall in about a third of the babies born with severe CP. And the reason was because instead of getting involved in very complex, expensive court cases, parents got automatic compensation and hospitals can concentrate on learning from what went wrong. And it's that learning culture. I feel that, the midwives and nurses and doctors involved when these things go wrong, they actually want nothing more than to really learn from it and to make sure the same mistake is not repeated. But the structures we put in place make that virtually impossible.
I think one of the things that hasn't been discussed actually here is training. And it's not just the way there was a change in the way midwives were changed. So they're trained. They're now do 3 years of training. Before, they used to have to be a nurse and then go on to do specialist. And I think there is an issue with that. I was talking to an obstetrician the other day who said, look, the fact is that birthing has become more problematic these days because women are older, they have more complex conditions. It's always been a difficult, there have always been problems, but it's getting harder and harder, and the training is not necessarily keeping up with that. There is also a terrible hierarchical issue on the wards. So what you will hear time and again is a midwife or a nurse will want to escalate a problem, and the doctor isn't hearing it, or they're not there, they're not in the room, or some junior member of staff just won't want to say anything and they sit on the problem. Well, all of that, I suppose, comes back to the culture, but it does come back to the way training needs to change. I mean, I'm speaking as somebody who had a baby at 47. I mean, I fall into that cohort of, problematic older women giving birth. But you can see this. The General Medical Council did try at some stage, and I'm not sure if they're still doing it, to get obstetricians and gynecologists and nurses and midwives to do some training together so that they could try and deal with this hierarchical issue that puts up such a barrier on the ward when something's going wrong.
Jeremy?
I agree with that. And I think that one of the biggest issues in training is on midwife training, where there is still a culture of so-called normal births, of trying to avoid getting a doctor involved in a birth. And there was a big Sunday Times investigation into this just this weekend. And the issue is that sometimes it's taking too long for people to get referred to a doctor when maybe a C-section is the safest thing for a baby in a particularly complex situation. And the training colleges all have been saying for some time they don't do this anymore. But the truth is that this still does exist. And I do think that you're absolutely right, Victoria. Teamwork and a culture that, in the end, the only thing that matters is safety of mother and child. That is the most important thing. Of course, a woman must make the final decision as to how a child is going to be born, but no woman in practice would ever want to do anything but the safest route, and sometimes they aren't given that information.
Kayleigh, do you have a sense of what needs to be done to drive that cultural change amongst staff? Is it a matter of training, or is it something beyond that?
I would say it's training. It comes down to funding. We're seeing the NHS being significantly stripped now. So I work in the NHS from a different type of trust, not an acute trust, and we're seeing cuts that are coming down the line, and it's constant. And what we're seeing across the board is burnout. We're seeing people that are afraid to speak up. That whistleblowers are afraid to speak out. It's systemic. It's culture. It's funding. It's improper regulation. It's improper oversight. It's huge.
Jeremy, can we just focus on the funding for a second, because both Victoria and Kayleigh have raised it. I mean, in your previous answer, you seem to be sort of suggesting it wasn't really about resourcing. Is that what you're saying?
Well, look, I don't want to pretend that the NHS hasn't had a very difficult period. I mean, what the budget for the NHS in the 2010, I think it was frozen in real terms. It wasn't cut. But there's been a lot of pressure in the NHS. When I became Health Secretary about halfway through the austerity period, I felt it needed more funding, and I secured a big increase in 2017, and it got a further increase in the pandemic. I mean, the facts are that out of all the advanced economies, we're about the fifth highest in terms of the proportion of our GDP we put into health. So I think, funding has been an issue, but I also think it's about culture, and I think it's about structures, and it's about training. It's about all these things that we say. I think in terms of the actual question of the most visible aspect of funding, which is the number of staff that you have, the bit that is puzzling to me is that, we've had I talked about an 11% increase in midwives. We've actually had about 11% decrease in births because of a falling birth rate. So, it may well be that there are some maternity units that are short-staffed, but I don't think that's the only issue. And I think we have to look at why it is that when there's a problem, it seems to be so difficult to get people to speak openly about it. And, I introduced something called duty of candour, which basically meant that it was against the law for hospitals to be anything other than truthful to families like Hayley's family when there's a tragedy or when there's any kind of patient safety incident. And I think it's had some success, but it hasn't worked in the way that I'd hoped. I was hoping there'll be a much more profound openness happening in the system than we've seen. So I think there are some deep-seated cultural issues that we need to look at as well.
Can I just also ask you about the regulation? Is the CQC fit for purpose?
It went really badly wrong after the pandemic. So I basically set up the CQC in its current format. And the way I set it up was that you should have experts looking at hospitals. So a maternity unit is not going to be investigated by a sort of 25-year-old student on their first job. It would be investigated by someone who was themselves a trained midwife or trained obstetrician who knew what they were looking for. And I think that is the right way of doing it. In the pandemic, after the pandemic, they changed that system to generalist inspections. And that is now thankfully being changed back. So I think the CQC is being put back on its feet. But yes, it's had some very, very big problems in recent years.
Victoria.
Well, I mean, Kayleigh knows better than I do. Perhaps you can explain what you and Rhiannon Davis, whose baby Kate died at Shrewsbury and Telford, I mean, actually did look at the CQC and found enormous problems with the way that they were investigating. I mean, probably better for Kayleigh to explain it.
Yeah, so Rhiannon and I undertook a piece of work where we looked at all the focused CQC inspections that were undertaken into maternity. So we read through all of them. We found inconsistencies. What we found was that previously, so trusts that were failing in maternity were rated as good. Once concerns were then raised by families, they were rated as inadequate, and failures then were spotted. But to date, I'm still seeing inconsistencies in the way that they report. I don't think what Jeremy said there about the sort of levels of staff that you've got undertaking the inspections currently. So they're quite, inspectors are paid quite a low salary. So I don't think you would expect it attract that experience that Jeremy would be expecting. And they've, they're not able to pick out where a trust is failing.
And do you think patient groups are taken seriously? And do you have a blueprint for how you would change things, how you would make things better?
Yes. So we've got ideas. Those are family voices. What I would like to see would be those services and the families coming together to create the change and the way forward. I don't think it can be done in isolation. I've seen green shoots of how services are working together with families, but there's still a very, very long way to go.
Jeremy, I mean, I don't know whether do you speak to Wes Streeting about these sorts of things? I mean, is there cooperation? Is your experience passed on and shared?
Yeah, I've had a lot of discussions with Wes. I think he is very committed to this. We had a debate in Parliament for Baby Loss Awareness Week. And, unusually as Secretary of State, he came and sat through the whole debate. He could have sent one of his junior ministers and he didn't. And I think he recognises that, what people like Kayleigh want is action. We've had so many reports now. I commissioned quite a lot of them myself, actually. And, in a way, rather than more recommendations, for example, Donna Ockenden in her report into Shrewsbury and Telford had a list of immediate and essential actions. And we just need to get on and implement those immediate and essential actions. They are immediate and they are essential, and we just need to get on with them. Or if the government doesn't want to do them, they need to say why they don't. So I hope that this new review that Valerie Amos is doing is going to report quickly, and we can just crack on with doing the things that we all know need to happen. But I do hope that as part of that, we look really hard at culture change and we ask the difficult question as to what it would take for doctors, nurses, midwives to be open in the way that families want them to be open. Because that seems to me, even if the answer we get is uncomfortable, we should find out what it is that is stopping that openness, because I think that is at the heart of why families feel time after time that they're not being told the truth and that, incidents are being covered up.
When you look back, I mean, are there things you wish you'd done? I mean, or if they brought you back now and said, look, what should we do that politicians maybe don't turn to first? Do you have recommendations?
Well, the thing that I would really like to do is end this litigation culture, because I feel that it is just a big barrier to, if you look at Sweden, if we had the same maternity safety levels of Sweden, we'd have one fewer baby dying every single day. And that would be amazing if we could get to that level. They're one of the safest in Europe. But they don't have this very adversarial system as soon as there's a tragedy. All that has to happen in Sweden is that the doctors say there was a mistake. They don't apportion blame, but they just say there was a mistake. What was supposed to happen didn't happen. And then the family automatically get compensation. And everyone can concentrate on trying to understand what went wrong and how to stop it happening again. And that is the kind of positive learning culture that somehow we need to get to in the NHS.
So finally, Victoria, what are the next steps?
Well, we do have this rapid maternity review that's looking into maternity services in England now. It's being led by Baroness Valerie Amos, and that is due to report next spring. Now, I feel conflicted about it. I mean, I'm glad that the spotlight is on it, but as we have said repeatedly through this, there have been any number of reports. Ockenden into Shrewsbury and Telford was 3 years ago with those urgent must-do now recommendations. How many of them have been taken up? I don't know. I remember talking to Bill Kirkup after Morecambe Bay, and I said to him, what if they don't introduce these recommendations? What if they don't follow through on them? And he looked at me aghast, as if to say, well, of course they're going to. Well, then I saw him at East Kent some years later when he'd just done that report, and I said, well, what are you thinking now? Because you wouldn't be here in East Kent if they'd followed through on the recommendations at Morecambe Bay. And that's the problem, is we're seeing what are very good reports into these scandals, and then it sort of seems to go into the ether. Now, I'm sure there have been some improvements, but because I am still doing these stories, these heartbreaking stories, not enough is changing. As we've agreed here today, will another rapid review help? I don't know. Will a public inquiry, that's one of the other calls, again, I don't know if it will help, but something needs to happen that is bigger and more than has been recommended so far.
Thank you all very much indeed for your time. Kayleigh and Jeremy, thank you for joining us. That's the forecast for today. Until next time, bye-bye.